Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Because she wasn't supposed to be there, not really. To most of them, Maria Santos was just the kitchen girl, the one who served breakfast before dawn and disappeared behind swinging metal doors before anyone remembered her name. But on that morning, even from the back of the room, she could sense that something was shifting. Something invisible but sharp, like the thin crack that appears in glass right before it shatters. The officers laughed too loudly. The younger soldiers kept their eyes low. And when Colonel Thompson entered the room, the air itself seemed to stiffen. He walked as if the floor owed him respect, tall, perfectly pressed uniform, boots polished so clean they reflected the lights above. Maria turned away, pretending to scrub a countertop that was already spotless. She learned that avoiding attention was often safer than catching it. 3 years. That's how long she'd been cooking for this base, chopping vegetables, stirring pots big enough to bathe in, washing pans until her hands cracked. 3 years of quiet service, 3 years of survival. For Maria, the army kitchen wasn't just a job. It was the only thread holding her family together. A sick mother back home, a younger brother still in school, their lives depended on the money she sent each month. She wore that responsibility like armor. And yet lately, that armor had started to feel thin. Because Colonel Thompson had started noticing her. At first, it was small, a glance too long, a comment that carried weight even when it sounded polite. She'd catch him watching her from across the mess hall, his eyes cold and calculating, like a man studying a chess piece he intended to remove from the board. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was nothing. Until one Tuesday morning, everything changed. Maria was carrying a tray stacked high with plates and steaming bowls. The smell of fresh soup filled the air. Soldiers were already lined up for breakfast, the noise of chatter echoing through the hall. She took a step forward, and then he was there. The colonel, standing directly in her path. It happened fast. The tray tilted, the soup spilled, and porcelain exploded across the floor. The room went silent. "Look what you've done," the colonel barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the silence. "You clumsy girl." Maria froze. The hot liquid burned her hands, but she didn't move. Every eye in the room was on her. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I didn't see you there. I'll clean this up right away." But the colonel wasn't finished. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but raising his cruelty. "This is what happens when we hire peasants who don't belong here." The word peasant hit her harder than the soup had. It was meant to remind her she wasn't one of them. Not a soldier, not an officer, just someone who cooked their meals. She swallowed hard, knelt, and began picking up the broken pieces. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. Anger. That was what shook her. The colonel smirked and turned away. "You'll make another batch," he said, "and tonight you'll stay late and wash every dish twice." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. The kind that hides discomfort, the kind that says we saw what happened, but we'll pretend we didn't. That night Maria stayed late just like he ordered. The kitchen was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming faintly. She scrubbed until her hands were raw, and when she thought she was alone, she heard the door open. "Working hard, I see," came that familiar voice. The colonel's reflection appeared in the metal of a hanging pot. He stood behind her, watching. Maria didn't turn around. "Just finishing up, sir." He took a few slow steps forward. "You work too hard for such a pretty girl." Maria's stomach turned. "I just want to do my job." "Your job could be easier," he said. "Lighter duties, better pay, maybe even a promotion." She finally looked up at him, saw the smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you, sir," she said evenly, "but I'm happy where I am." For a long moment he just stared at her. Then his expression hardened. "You should think carefully about opportunities when they're offered," he said. Not everyone gets a second chance. And then he was gone. Maria stood there for a long time after, gripping the edge of the counter. Her pulse was pounding, her jaw tight. She'd heard whispers before, stories from other women who worked late, about officers who offered favors and made threats when refused. She never thought she'd become one of them. That night, as she walked back to her small barracks room, Maria made herself a promise: he will not break me. But even as she tried to believe it, she knew this wasn't over. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. The kitchen smelled of coffee and damp bread, steam rising from the pots. The soldiers came and went, and she moved among them like a ghost, silent, efficient, invisible. Except to him. He watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. Maria forced herself not to look up, but inside, every instinct screamed danger. The colonel had begun visiting the kitchen more often, sometimes to criticize her cooking, sometimes to move things around so she'd trip, sometimes just to stand there, close enough to make her skin crawl. And always, always when no one else was watching. At first no one noticed, then slowly whispers began. Soldiers who respected Maria started avoiding her gaze. Some looked guilty, others just afraid. Maria knew what they were thinking: don't get involved, don't draw his attention. She didn't blame them. Fear of power made good men small. But she wasn't small anymore. She started keeping notes, short, coded entries in a small notebook hidden beneath her mattress. Times, dates, witnesses, every insult, every threat, every unwanted visit. Her hands shook as she wrote sometimes, but she knew someday those words might save her. Colonel Thompson didn't know about the notebook. He didn't know she had grown up with 3 older brothers who taught her how to defend herself. He didn't know she'd spent years working in rough factories before joining the army kitchen, where she learned to survive under pressure. All he saw was a woman he thought he could control. One morning, while chopping vegetables, Maria noticed her friend Carmen staring at the bruises on her forearm. "What happened?" Carmen whispered. Maria hesitated. "I fell." Carmen didn't believe her. "Maria." "Please," Maria said quietly, "don't ask." Carmen nodded, but the sadness in her eyes lingered. Maria returned to her work, cutting faster than before, her anger rhythmically keeping pace with the knife. That night the colonel appeared again. The smell of soap and bleach hung in the air. Maria was scrubbing pans when she felt his presence behind her. "You know, Maria," he said softly, "I've been thinking about your family. Your mother's medical bills must be hard to manage." Her hands froze. "How do you know about that?" He smiled. "I have access to personnel files. The Army has special funds for hardship cases. I could help." Maria slowly turned to face him. "What kind of help?" "The kind that requires gratitude," he said. "The kind that shows you understand how things work around here." Her throat went dry. She took a small step back, the smell of chemicals burning her nose. "I'm grateful for my job, sir." He leaned closer. "Working hard isn't enough, Maria. Loyalty means flexibility." Maria's pulse hammered in her chest. "Sir, please let go of my arm." He didn't. He just smiled. When he finally released her, he said, "Think about it. You have until tomorrow evening to decide." Then he walked away. Maria stood there, shaking. She could feel the bruise forming beneath his fingers. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared at the empty doorway and whispered, "You made your mistake, Colonel." That night she called home. "Is Mama doing better?" she asked. Her brother's voice cracked. "Doctors say she needs surgery soon, but we still don't have the money." Maria closed her eyes. "Don't worry, I'll find a way." After hanging up, she sat on her bed and stared at the letter she had written days earlier, the one meant for emergencies. She opened it, added a few words, and sealed it again. Then she began preparing. The next evening she would go to his office, just like he asked. But she would not go as his victim. She had a plan, and she would not walk out of that office broken. She would walk out free. She stood outside his office door, her palms slick with sweat. 18:00 hours. The sun was setting behind the barracks, its light fading across the concrete like the last warmth before a storm. Maria could hear voices from the hallway, laughter, footsteps, the distant rumble of engines. But in her mind, everything was silent. Her heart beat so loud it drowned out the world. She stared at the brass nameplate, "Call Richard Thompson." Her reflection trembled on the polished metal. For a moment she thought about walking away, pretending none of this was happening. But then she remembered her mother's frail hands, her brother's hopeful voice, the way the colonel had gripped her arm and smiled. No, this ended tonight. She knocked once. "Enter," came the voice from inside. Maria stepped in. The air in the office was heavy, the smell of whiskey and polished wood thick enough to choke on. The colonel wasn't sitting behind his desk this time. He was lounging in an armchair, one leg crossed over the other, a drink in his hand. "Right on time," he said. "I appreciate punctuality." Maria didn't answer. She stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her apron, the way she always did when serving meals. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit down, Maria. Let's discuss your future." "I prefer to stand, sir." His eyes narrowed. "I wasn't making a suggestion." Maria took a small step forward but didn't sit. "What did you want to talk about?" He smiled, that same confident, poisonous smile. "I offered you a chance. I want to make sure you've made the right decision." "I have." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Good. Then you understand that cooperation benefits us both." Maria didn't respond. Her silence was deliberate. The colonel's smile faded. He rose from the chair, slow and deliberate, setting his glass down on the table. He was taller than she'd remembered, a wall of authority and arrogance. "You're a clever girl," he said softly. "You know how this works. You please me, I protect you. You refuse." He gestured around the room. "Things get difficult." Maria's voice came out steady. "I'm not here to please you, sir. I'm here to work." The colonel's eyes turned cold. "You're not in a position to negotiate, Maria." He took a step forward. She could feel the heat of his breath, smell the alcohol. Her muscles tensed, every nerve screaming for distance. "Your mother needs surgery," he whispered. "I could make that happen tomorrow. All it takes is one word from me." She took a slow breath. "And what happens if I refuse?" He smirked. "Accidents happen. Kitchens can be dangerous places." That was it. The moment when the line between threat and promise vanished. Maria forced herself to stay calm. "I need time to think about this." "Tomorrow night," he said. "Same time, same place. Come prepared to show me your gratitude." When she left the office, her legs were trembling. The hallway felt too bright, too open, too full of eyes that saw nothing. She didn't look at anyone, didn't speak. She just walked back to her quarters, her breath shallow, her mind racing. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight with fear and fury. She thought about the girls in the factory where she once worked, how the manager used to corner them in the storage room, how nobody ever said anything. Not this time. She wouldn't let him win. She opened her notebook, the one hidden under her mattress, and wrote one last line. "Tomorrow, 1800, his office ended." Then she folded the page carefully and tucked it into an envelope marked with her brother's name. The next day felt endless. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, finishing every task with mechanical precision. No one dared to ask what was wrong, but they could sense it. The way her eyes didn't soften, the way her hands never stopped moving. Sergeant Rodriguez, the kind man who often lingered near the serving line, noticed. "Maria," he said quietly, "if you ever need help—" "I'm fine," she interrupted. He looked unconvinced. "You remind me of my daughter. She gets that same look when she's pretending she's fine." Maria forced a faint smile. "Then tell her it means she's stronger than people think." Rodriguez hesitated, then nodded. At 17:30, she washed her hands one final time, dried them slowly, and looked at her reflection in the stainless steel wall. The woman staring back wasn't frightened anymore. She looked ready. She whispered to herself, "Whatever happens, I walk out with my dignity." The colonel's door was slightly ajar when she arrived. He was waiting, as if he'd been counting the seconds. "Come in," he said, his tone smooth, too calm. She stepped inside. The lights were dim. His jacket was off. The room looked different now, smaller, darker, like a trap. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he began, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. "We can reach an understanding tonight." "I've been thinking too," Maria said softly. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what conclusion did you reach?" "That you should stop." He laughed, a deep, unpleasant sound. "Stop, my dear, this isn't something you get to decide." He set the glass down and walked toward her. She didn't move. "I can make your family's life easy," he said, "or I can make it disappear." Maria's heart was hammering, but her face stayed calm. "You're right about one thing," she said. "This isn't something I get to decide." He grinned. "Good girl." She took a breath. "Because I already decided yesterday." Before he could speak, she added quietly, "Remember this moment, Colonel. I gave you a chance to stop." Confusion flickered across his face, just for a second. Then he reached out to touch her shoulder. Maria moved first. She grabbed his wrist with both hands and twisted sharply, a motion she'd practiced 100 times in her childhood, sparring with her brothers. The colonel shouted in pain, staggering backward. "What are you doing?" Maria released his wrist, "Refusing your offer." His face twisted in rage. "You stupid girl, you have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I do," she said, "a coward who hides behind rank." He lunged forward, grabbing for the door to lock it. "You'll regret this." The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. Maria knew what that sound meant. There was no going back. He turned on her, his expression almost unrecognizable, a mix of fury and disbelief that anyone dared stand against him. "I tried to be generous," he growled. "Now I'll teach you what happens to people who forget their place." Maria didn't answer. She just took a slow step back, her eyes fixed on his hands. He swung first, wild and fast, but sloppy. Rage makes people clumsy. Maria ducked, her body moving on instinct. The punch cut through empty air. "Hold still," he roared. She didn't. She moved toward the desk, her mind calculating space, distance, weight. There was a brass paperweight on the edge of the desk. Heavy, solid. The colonel swung again. She ducked, grabbed the paperweight, and raised it. "Stay back," she warned. He laughed, actually laughed. "You think you can threaten me? You're nothing." He lunged. They collided, papers flying everywhere. The lamp crashed to the floor. The sound of breaking glass filled the air. Maria rolled away and scrambled to her feet. Her arm burned from where he'd grabbed her. The colonel straightened slowly, breathing hard. Something in his eyes had changed, darker, desperate. He reached for his belt, yanking it free. "You want to fight? Fine. I've killed men with my bare hands." The belt cracked through the air. She raised her arms to block it, the sting sliced through her skin. Pain flared, but she didn't back away. Somewhere in her memory, she heard her brother Carlos's voice. "Don't just defend. Attack when they don't expect it." The belt came down again, but this time she grabbed it mid-swing. He tried to pull it back. She held on. Their eyes locked, his wild with anger, her steady with resolve. Then she let go. He stumbled backward, thrown off balance. His shoulder hit the desk, and for a brief moment he looked almost human, vulnerable, confused. Maria saw her chance. She stepped forward, her voice low and firm. "This ends now." He charged again. But this time she didn't retreat. She ducked, turned her body, and shoved with all her strength. The colonel lost his footing, crashing against the wall. The impact rattled the framed certificates and medals that hung behind him. He turned, breathing hard, his face flushed red. "You'll pay for this." "No," Maria said, her voice trembling but fierce. "You will." He swung one last time. Maria dodged and struck, a quick, precise hit with the heavy paperweight still in her hand. It connected with his forearm. The sound was sickening, a crack, a shout, the thud of flesh against wood. The colonel stumbled, clutching his arm, blood already soaking through the fabric of his sleeve. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. Maria was breathing hard, sweat dripping down her face, the weight still in her hand. "Call for help," he gasped. "You'll go to prison for this." "Will I?" she said softly. "Or will you tell them why I was in your office after hours?" He froze. For the first time, he realized how much he'd underestimated her. Maria took a step closer, voice low but steady. "You tried to break me, Colonel. You should have known I don't break." The colonel's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the locked door, then back at her. For the first time, he didn't look powerful. He looked trapped. And Maria, standing there, battered, bleeding, but unbroken, finally understood what her father had meant when he said, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it." Maria's pulse thundered in her ears. The colonel's grip dug into her wrist, the veins in his arm bulging with rage. He wasn't thinking anymore, not about rank, not about consequences, just domination. The same twisted instinct that had guided every cruel choice he'd ever made. "Let me go," she demanded again. But he only tightened his grip, pushing her harder into the wall. The shelves behind her rattled. The smell of whiskey and blood mixed thick in the air. "You humiliated me," he hissed, his voice breaking with anger. "No woman has ever done that to me before." Maria's mind raced. He's lost control. He'll destroy everything, himself included. She forced her breathing to slow. "Think, Maria, think." Her father's voice echoed in her memory, that gentle firmness he used to have when teaching her to hold her ground. "When someone corners you, you don't meet their power, you redirect it." She pretended to wilt, letting her body go slack. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt me anymore." The colonel's expression shifted, arrogance flickering back in. He thought she'd broken. "That's better," he muttered, lowering his voice to a cruel purr. "That's how this should have been from the start." He loosened his hold slightly, a fatal mistake. In that instant, Maria's entire body moved on instinct. Her knee shot upward, fast, sharp, precise. The impact made him grunt, a raw animal sound, and stumble backward, his face twisted in agony. He dropped to one knee, clutching himself, gasping for air. Maria didn't hesitate. Her brother Miguel's voice rang in her head now. "If you ever have to fight, make it count. End it before they get back up." The colonel was bent over, disoriented, one hand gripping the desk for balance. Maria stepped forward, grabbed his shoulders, and brought her knee up again, this time higher. It connected with his face. The sound was awful, a sharp, solid crack that made the room spin for a second. Blood burst from his nose, splattering across his uniform and the floor. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, trying to regain balance. Maria backed away, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her entire body trembled, not from weakness, but from adrenaline. The colonel staggered, his eyes unfocused, mouth open in a soundless snarl. His hand reached for the desk again, but his boot slipped on the slick surface of spilled whiskey and blood. He fell sideways. Time seemed to slow. Maria saw him twisting in midair, his leg catching the edge of the desk. Then came the sound, a deep, terrible crack, the sound of bone giving way. The colonel screamed. He hit the floor hard, clutching his leg. His cries filled the room, raw, desperate, human. Maria froze, chest heaving, her mind blank. She hadn't planned this, not the fall, not the break, but it had happened. The man who'd terrorized her for months was lying in front of her, his leg bent at an impossible angle, his face a mask of shock and pain. "My leg," he shouted. "I think you broke my leg." Maria stared, her eyes wide, her whole body trembling. He looked up at her, the predator now begging. "Help me," he gasped. "Call for medical assistance." Maria took a slow breath, forcing her thoughts to align. She looked at him, the man who'd threatened her family, her life, her dignity, and said quietly, "Like you helped me when I asked you to stop." His scream tore through the room again, echoing down the corridor. She turned toward his desk and picked up the phone. Her hand hovered over the receiver. She could hear soldiers outside, faint footsteps, voices, someone calling a name. She pressed the number for the base medical line. "This is Maria Santos," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Colonel Thompson's office. He's been injured. Please send medical assistance immediately." The door handle rattled behind her. "Colonel Thompson," someone called. "Sir, are you all right?" Maria recognized the voice, Sergeant Rodriguez. She walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped aside. Rodriguez burst in with two other soldiers. They stopped dead at the sight, the colonel writhing on the floor, blood on his face, leg twisted, the room in ruins. "What happened here?" Rodriguez demanded, looking between Maria and the colonel. Maria's voice was quiet, even. "He attacked me. I defended myself." The colonel's voice was hoarse, furious. "She's lying. She attacked me. Arrest her." Rodriguez knelt beside him, assessing the injuries. But his eyes never left Maria's face, calm, composed, lips split and swelling, bruises on her arms. Something didn't add up, not the way the colonel was claiming it anyway. Within minutes, medics arrived. They lifted the colonel onto a stretcher, his screams filling the corridor. Soldiers gathered in the hallway, whispering, staring at Maria. She stood motionless, eyes lowered, her hands clasped in front of her again, the same way she'd stood every day in that kitchen. Only this time, she wasn't invisible. Rodriguez turned to her quietly. "Maria, I believe you." She didn't answer. She just nodded, her eyes wet but fierce. The colonel was taken to the base hospital. Maria was escorted to Major Williams's office for questioning. Hours passed, questions, statements, forms, photographs of her bruises. Through it all, Maria spoke in a calm, measured voice. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't soften. "I told him no," she said simply. "He didn't listen." Major Williams, a man known for his strict fairness, listened in silence. He'd worked under Thompson for years, respected him, even. But as Maria spoke, as he read her file, something cold settled in his gut. When she left the room, Williams called for Sergeant Rodriguez. "Interview everyone who knows her, everyone who's worked near Thompson. I want truth, not loyalty." That night, Maria sat alone in her barracks, her body aching, her mind strangely quiet. She survived, but she didn't feel victorious, just hollow. She looked down at her hands, at the faint traces of blood under her fingernails. In the silence, she whispered to herself, he would have kept hurting others. It had to end. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry, not from fear, but from release. 2 days later, word spread across the base like wildfire. An investigation, witness interviews, evidence, and whispers, so many whispers. Some called Maria a liar, others called her brave. Then one by one, women started coming forward. 7 in total, each with a story eerily similar to hers, late meetings, threats, unwanted hands. Maria's courage had given them theirs. When Sergeant Rodriguez told her, she stared at the floor for a long time before whispering, "So it wasn't just me." He shook his head. It never is. It just takes one person to make it stop. By the end of the week, Colonel Thompson was under arrest, facing charges of assault, harassment, and abuse of authority. His career, reputation, everything he built on fear and silence gone. Maria sat outside the commander's office when the news was delivered. Her hands were folded in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just exhaled a slow, heavy breath that carried months of pain with it. Major Williams stepped out and said softly, "Miss Santos, your transfer been approved. With a promotion, the Army will cover your mother's medical expenses." Maria met his eyes. "Thank you, sir." Then, almost in a whisper, "It's over now." Williams shook his head. "No, you just started something that should have begun a long time ago." Weeks later, Maria stood on the parade ground, the sun blazing over hundreds of soldiers gathered in silence. Major Williams's voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Today, we honor a woman who showed courage when the system failed to protect her. Miss Maria Santos reminded us that integrity doesn't wear rank. It lives in those who refuse to surrender their dignity." Applause thundered through the air. Maria stepped forward slowly. The faces watching her weren't mocking or dismissive anymore. They were respectful, humbled. She spoke softly, but her words carried far. "I didn't fight him because I was brave. I fought because I had no choice. Fear only has power until someone says no." And for a long, still moment, even the soldiers who'd once ignored her stood in silent respect. She later walked past the medical ward, where Colonel Thompson lay recovering, his leg bound in steel rods. He looked at her as she passed, bitterness clouding his eyes. She didn't stop, she didn't speak. She just walked on. Because dignity doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply acts. They said justice moves slowly. But on that base, it moved like thunder. Within 48 hours, Colonel Thompson's office was sealed. The blinds were drawn, the bloodstains scrubbed away, the broken glass swept into silence. But the story, his story, her story, could not be cleaned so easily. Rumors turned into questions. Questions turned into statements. And statements became a storm the colonel could no longer command. Maria had gone from invisible to unforgettable. But she never wanted fame, only peace. When the investigation began, she was summoned daily, sometimes for hours, answering the same questions over and over again. The officers wanted every detail, every word, every gesture. She told them everything, calmly, carefully, without bitterness. "I didn't want to fight him," she said once, her voice low. "I just wanted him to stop." Major Williams studied her across the table, the man's gray eyes reflecting the weight of her words. "You did what our code demands, Miss Santos. You defended yourself and upheld your honor." Maria shook her head. "Honor doesn't feel like this, sir. It feels heavy." He paused for a moment, then said quietly, "That's because you're carrying more than yours." Each day, new witnesses came forward. Carmen from the kitchen, trembling but resolute. Private Ortiz, who'd once overheard the colonel's threats but stayed silent out of fear. Even Sergeant Rodriguez, who admitted he'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't dared to act. The picture that emerged was clear: a man who had used rank as a weapon, charm as camouflage, and silence as his shield. But now that shield was gone. 7 other women gave statements, 7. Each one describing the same tactics: flattery, promises, then threats. Each one describing the same despair. Maria sat in the waiting room while others gave testimony, listening to muffled voices through the walls. Sometimes she closed her eyes, unable to breathe as the echoes of their stories blurred into her own. She realized something then. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had opened a door others could finally walk through. And that somehow made the pain easier to bear. 2 weeks later, she was called to the tribunal. The military courtroom was cold, all steel and stone and echoing footsteps. The colonel sat in a wheelchair at the far end, his leg bound in metal braces. His face was pale, lips tight, eyes hard. Maria didn't look away. When the questioning began, the lawyers tried to twist her words, to turn the story into something less heroic, more questionable. "You admit you struck Colonel Thompson," one attorney said. "Yes," Maria replied, "in self-defense." He adjusted his glasses. "But why not simply leave the office?" Maria looked directly at him. The door was locked. Silence. Even the colonel's attorney didn't know how to respond. "Did you at any point provoke him?" Maria's hands rested on the table, calm and still. "I provoked him by saying no." The words hit the room like a slap. From the corner of her eye, she saw the colonel flinch, barely, but enough. The trial dragged for days. Witness after witness stepped forward, some with trembling voices, some with tears. By the third day, the weight of evidence was undeniable. When the verdict was finally read, the air in the courtroom felt charged. "Colonel Richard Thompson," the presiding officer declared, "you are hereby found guilty of assault, harassment, and conduct unbecoming an officer. You are sentenced to dishonorable discharge and loss of pension." A gasp swept through the room. The colonel's face twisted, not from pain but from disbelief. For the first time in his life, power had abandoned him. Maria sat perfectly still, her fingers intertwined. She didn't cheer, she didn't even smile. Justice, she realized, wasn't loud, it was quiet. It didn't roar, it sighed. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of clapping. A few soldiers, standing at a distance, saluted her as she passed. Others avoided her eyes, not out of shame but reverence. Carmen met her at the steps, tears shining in her eyes. "It's over, Maria, you did it." Maria hugged her friend tightly. "No," she whispered, "we did it." The army moved quickly after that. Policies rewritten. Training sessions launched. Anonymous reporting lines established. Her story had become the catalyst for change, whispered in dining halls, repeated in training lectures, taught in ethics seminars. They called it the Santos Reform. Maria never liked the name. "I didn't make reform," she told Sergeant Rodriguez one morning as they loaded crates of supplies. "I just made a choice." Rodriguez smiled. "That's how reform begins." Months passed. Maria was transferred to a new base in the south, far from the ghosts of that office. The day she left, the entire kitchen staff gathered to say goodbye. Even soldiers she'd barely spoken to came to shake her hand. When she stepped onto the transport truck, she looked back once, at the kitchen windows glinting in the afternoon sun, the flag fluttering high above the courtyard. For the first time, she felt something close to peace. Her new posting was different, smaller, quieter, surrounded by hills instead of barracks. She became head of kitchen operations, managing a small team. She worked with purpose, firm, kind, unshakable. The younger recruits respected her instantly. They saw it in her posture, her silence, her way of speaking only when it mattered. And they whispered stories. About the woman who'd fought a colonel and won. About the cook who'd broken his leg and changed an army. Maria never confirmed or denied any of it. She simply said, "Everyone deserves respect. Don't wait until someone takes it away to realize that." 6 months later, a letter arrived. An official envelope, stamped with the military seal. Inside was a short note from Major Williams. "Miss Santos, the reforms you inspired are now active in all units. Harassment prevention is mandatory training. Reporting channels are open. You reminded us that integrity doesn't wear rank. The Army owes you more than words. Major William J. Williams." Maria read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her drawer beside the old letter she'd once written to her brother, the one she'd never had to send. Her mother's surgery had gone well. Her brother was in school, top of his class. Life somehow had moved forward. One evening, as the sun sank over the southern hills, Maria sat outside the mess hall, watching the recruits laugh and tease each other. The same kind of laughter she'd once envied when she was invisible. Carmen's voice echoed in her memory. "You should have been a soldier, Maria." Maybe she was one all along, just not the kind that carried a rifle. Her war had been different, quieter, but just as real. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind rustling through the flags. Somewhere deep inside, she finally allowed herself to breathe. They would still tell her story years later, embellished, dramatized, transformed into something almost mythic. But Maria never cared for the legends. The truth, she believed, was simpler. It wasn't about breaking bones or defying ranks. It was about something deeper, something the colonel would never understand. Courage isn't loud. It's the quiet refusal to bow. That night, Maria wrote one last line in her old notebook, the one that had once recorded her fear. Sometimes the smallest person in the room carries the weight of everyone's silence, and when she finally speaks, the world changes. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and smiled faintly. Tomorrow she'd wake up early again, cook for 200 soldiers, wash the pots, mop the floors. But this time, when she walked through those doors, everyone would see her. Not as the kitchen worker, not as the victim, but as the woman who stood up and refused to kneel. How do you measure time after survival? Not in years, not in promotions, but in peace, those quiet mornings when you wake up without fear. Maria Santos had learned that peace was not silence, it was safety. And for the first time in her life, she had it. 5 years had passed since the night in Colonel Thompson's office, the night that changed everything. The army had moved on, but the story had not died. It was told in whispers across bases and barracks, classrooms and training halls. They called it the kitchen confrontation. Some turned it into legend, others into a lesson. But Maria never sought the legend. She sought purpose. At the southern base, Maria had become more than a head of operations. She'd become a voice, quiet but unwavering. New recruits arrived every few months, fresh-faced and nervous, carrying their hopes and fears in duffel bags that always seemed too heavy. Many of them were women, some barely out of school, some with stories that looked too much like Maria's old life. She didn't give speeches. She just led by example. When a recruit burned her hand on a stove, Maria was there before the medics. When a young clerk broke down after a sergeant's harsh words, Maria sat beside her in silence until the tears stopped. And when a girl named Luisa whispered one night, "Ma'am, what do you do when someone powerful doesn't take no for an answer?" Maria didn't hesitate. "You say no again," she said softly, "and louder this time, until they hear you or until someone else does." Luisa blinked away tears. "But what if no one believes me?" Maria looked at her, the same fear she once carried staring back through younger eyes. "Then believe yourself first," she said. "That's where it starts." Her reputation spread quietly. People came to her not because of her title, but because of her steadiness. She never shouted, never made promises she couldn't keep, but when she spoke, people listened. Once during a staff meeting, a young corporal complained about being ignored by senior officers. Maria listened, then said, "Respect doesn't start when others give it. It starts when you refuse to let them take it." The room went silent. The corporal nodded, eyes wet. After that, Maria was invited to speak at leadership workshops, not as an officer, but as a symbol of resilience. Her words were simple, her tone was calm, but every sentence carried a weight that no rank could command. One morning she received a call from Major Williams, now a general. "Miss Santos," he said, his voice as warm as she remembered. We're establishing a new ethics and conduct program at headquarters. We'd like you to consult on it." Maria blinked, stunned. "Me?" "Yes, you," William said. "Your story didn't just change policy, it changed culture. People listen when you speak. They see themselves in you." Maria hesitated. "I'm not an officer." "You don't have to be," he replied. "Courage outranks everything." The first time she stepped into the Capitol headquarters, she felt that same cold air she'd once breathed outside the colonel's office, the sterile scent of power and order. But this time, her steps were steady. She wasn't here to serve food. She was here to serve change. The officers stood when she entered. Some saluted. She nodded politely, humbled but composed. She shared her story not as a victim, but as a teacher. She spoke of silence, how it grows like mold in dark corners, feeding on fear. She spoke of power, how it means nothing if it's built on control instead of respect. And she spoke of dignity, how it cannot be given or taken, only claimed. By the time she finished, no one in the room moved. Some took notes, others simply sat in quiet reflection. The next day, the Army officially launched its Dignity and Discipline Directive, a new policy mandating mentorship, psychological support, and accountability for all ranks. At the bottom of the document, in fine print, it read, "Inspired by the events surrounding Miss Maria Santos." That night she sat alone in her quarters, staring out the window at the stars. She thought about her mother, gone now, peacefully, after years of illness. She thought about her brother, now an engineer married with children of his own. He often told her, "Mama said you didn't just save her life, you saved mine too." Maria smiled faintly whenever she heard that, because maybe, in some quiet way, he was right. One weekend, during a base event, a journalist asked to interview her for a documentary about women in the armed forces. They set up the camera under the bright sun, soldiers milling about in the background. "Miss Santos," the interviewer asked, "when you look back at what happened, do you think you were brave?" Maria smiled slightly. "No, I think I was desperate. Brave came later when I kept showing up afterward." The interviewer hesitated. "If you could tell your younger self one thing, what would it be?" Maria looked into the camera, her eyes soft but steady. "Don't confuse silence with peace. Sometimes peace only comes after the noise." After the interview aired, letters began arriving, dozens, then hundreds. From young soldiers, from teachers, from factory workers. Women who'd never met her, but saw themselves in her story. One letter read, "Because of you, I told my boss to stop touching me. I thought I'd lose my job. Instead, he lost his." Another simply said, "Thank you for reminding me that saying no isn't weakness." Maria read every letter carefully. Some made her cry, some made her smile, all made her proud. Years passed. Maria's hair began to silver at the temples. The lines around her eyes deepened, not from worry, from laughter, from living. She stayed at the southern base long after she could have transferred again. It felt like home. The walls no longer whispered fear. They hummed with purpose. Every few months, she taught a small class to new recruits, leadership from the ground up. Her first lesson was always the same. The strongest people aren't the ones who fight the loudest battles. They're the ones who choose not to become what broke them. One afternoon, after a long day in the kitchen, she found Luisa, the young recruit from years ago, waiting by the door in uniform. "Ma'am," Luisa said, smiling shyly, "I've been promoted to sergeant. I just wanted to say thank you." Maria smiled. "For what?" "For believing me when I didn't believe myself." Maria placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's what we do, Luisa. We stand where others once stood for us." As Luisa walked away, Maria watched her go, strong, confident, unafraid. And for the first time, Maria understood what legacy truly meant. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat by the mess hall window. the same kind she used to scrub as a young worker years ago. The world outside was calm, painted gold and amber. Soldiers were laughing somewhere in the distance, music playing faintly from a radio. She whispered to herself, maybe this is what victory feels like, not revenge, not triumph, just peace. The wind carried her words away, soft as prayer. And in that moment, Maria Santos, once the invisible kitchen girl, smiled at the thought that the world had finally learned her most important lesson. Dignity doesn't need an audience. Sometimes it only needs the courage to stand. The years had softened the base. New buildings rose where old barracks once stood, painted fresh every season. The air felt different now, lighter, freer. Maria Santos walked the same paths she had once cleaned at dawn, but now others greeted her first. "Good morning, ma'am." "Morning, Miss Santos." The respect was genuine, not from fear or formality but recognition. Everyone knew who she was, even those who hadn't been born when her story began. They'd heard it whispered in classrooms and canteens. The kitchen worker who stood up to a colonel. The woman who turned a wound into a law. Maria always smiled politely when people mentioned it, but inside she never liked the legend. Legends sound too easy. Her truth had never been easy. It was late spring when the new commanding officer arrived, Lieutenant Colonel Raphael Thompson. The name alone stopped Maria in her tracks. Thompson. For a moment she thought she'd misheard. But when she saw him for the first time, tall, well-kept uniform, calm eyes that carried something she couldn't read, she knew it wasn't coincidence. He was younger than the man she remembered, maybe in his mid-30s. And though his face bore none of the cruelty she'd once known, the resemblance was undeniable. The same bone structure, the same sharp jawline softened only by sincerity. He extended his hand when they were introduced. "You must be Miss Santos. I've heard a lot about you." Maria hesitated, then took his hand. "I imagine you have." His grip was steady but gentle. "My father, he spoke of you once. Not kindly, I'm afraid." Maria studied his face. "And what do you think of me, Colonel?" He smiled faintly, sadness flickering beneath. "I think you were the first person who ever told him no." That evening, Maria sat alone in her quarters, the weight of memory pressing against her chest. She hadn't spoken the colonel's name in years, not since the day she'd testified. And yet here it was again, attached to a man who seemed nothing like him. She should have felt anger, but instead she felt pity. People carry their names like shadows, she thought. Some run from them, some try to repair them. The next morning, Raphael visited the kitchen. He moved with quiet humility, greeting each worker, asking questions, listening. When he spoke to Maria, his voice held no authority, only respect. "My father died 3 years ago," he said. "I didn't go to the funeral, I couldn't, not after what I learned." Maria paused, setting down a ladle. "I see." He took a breath. "I found his files, personal journals, letters, the investigation reports, your testimony." Maria's hand stilled. Raphael continued, his tone soft. "I don't want to reopen wounds. I just needed to say I'm sorry for what he did, for what his name did." Maria turned to face him. His eyes were clear, not defensive, not pleading, just honest. "You don't need to apologize for him," she said quietly. "You're not him." "I know," he said, "but I carry the same name, and I want it to mean something different now." From that day on, something subtle shifted. Raphael and Maria crossed paths often, during morning inspections, community programs, or simple coffee breaks. Their conversations were always respectful, often thoughtful. He asked about her work, about the reforms that followed. She told him about the progress, the mentorships, the support networks, the quiet victories that never made the headlines. "Do you ever regret staying in the army after what happened?" he asked once. Maria smiled faintly. No, if I'd left, it would have meant he won. Raphael nodded slowly. Then maybe that's why you became part of this story, to finish what he started the wrong way. Maria studied him. And maybe you're here to remind me that not every Thompson is the same. He smiled, small but genuine. I hope so. Months passed. Together, they launched a new initiative, Project Valor, a program that trained officers to recognize and prevent abuse of power. During the first seminar, Maria stood beside Raphael on stage. The hall was filled with soldiers of every rank, some skeptical, some curious, some deeply moved. Raphael spoke first. Power, he said, is not given to control others, it's given to protect them. Then Maria took the podium. The lights glinted off her silver hair, but her voice carried strong and steady. I used to think dignity was something others could take from you, she said. But I learned it's something only you can surrender. And once you stop surrendering, no one can own you again. The room was silent. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, not out of defiance but reflection. When the session ended, one young officer approached her. Ma'am, she said softly, my mother told me your story when I joined. She said you taught her that courage doesn't need permission. Maria smiled. Your mother was right. That night after the seminar, Raphael found her sitting outside under the open sky. The stars were bright, the same kind that had once watched her cry outside her barracks long ago. He handed her a cup of tea. You changed more than policies, he said. You changed people. Maria looked up at him. And you, Colonel, you gave a name a second chance. He smiled, the kind that carried gratitude instead of pride. Maybe that's what redemption looks like. The years went on and Project Valor spread across the country. Bases adopted its principles. New officers were trained in empathy, respect, and integrity, words that once sounded like theory but now lived in practice. And though Maria never sought recognition, one day the Defense Council called her to the Capitol again. When she entered the hall, she saw hundreds of uniforms, men and women standing at attention. The speaker's voice echoed through the chamber. For acts of exceptional courage and integrity, for changing the moral fabric of this institution, we award the Medal of Civil Honor to Miss Maria Santos. The applause was thunderous. Maria stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling slightly as the medal was placed around her neck. The weight of it was symbolic, a reminder of both pain and perseverance. When the clapping faded, she leaned into the microphone. Her voice, calm as always, filled the hall. This medal doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every woman who stayed silent out of fear, and every man who learned to listen instead of command. The world doesn't change in one night. It changes one choice at a time. And then she paused, her eyes finding Raphael's in the crowd. Forgiveness, she said softly, is not forgetting. It's refusing to let hate become your story. The entire hall stood. The applause lasted minutes. After the ceremony, Raphael walked beside her through the courtyard, where flags fluttered in the wind. My father would have never believed this, he said. Maria smiled faintly. Neither would I. He looked at her curiously. Do you forgive him? Maria stopped walking. The sunlight caught her face, older, wiser, still fierce. I forgave myself first, she said. Then forgiving him became easier. Raphael nodded, emotion tightening his voice. Thank you for giving me the chance to make the name mean something better. Maria looked at him kindly. You already have. That evening, Maria stood on the balcony of her quarters, watching the sunset. The sky burned gold, fading to rose. She thought about the girl she once was, the one scrubbing pots before dawn, scared to speak, scared to exist. If that girl could see her now, she'd know that strength doesn't roar. It whispers, steady as breath. Maria closed her eyes and smiled. Because she had lived long enough to see what she once only dreamed of, a world where silence was no longer survival, it was peace. Time changes everything. Buildings crumble, uniforms fade, and even the loudest stories become whispers. But some names, some acts, never truly leave the air. Maria Santos had grown older but not smaller. Her steps were slower now, her hair a silver crown, yet her presence still carried the same quiet authority that once silenced a courtroom. She lived in a small house near the southern base, the same one she'd served decades ago. She'd retired 5 years earlier, but her mornings still followed the same rhythm. Up before sunrise. Coffee. Walk to the hill overlooking the flag. From there she could see everything, the barracks, the training yard, the kitchen she'd once cleaned on her knees. Some mornings she'd laugh softly to herself. So much fuss over a broom and a pot, she'd whisper, and yet that's where everything began. The world had changed around her. Women now served in every division, pilots, commanders, strategists. The dignity directive she'd once helped shape was now part of every military code. But what mattered most to Maria wasn't the laws. It was the faces, the young ones who looked her in the eye unafraid. Every month the base invited her to speak to new recruits. They called it the Santos session. It was never about her victory. It was about resilience. And she always began the same way. I wasn't strong because I wanted to be. I was strong because I had no choice. But strength, once found, becomes a duty. You owe it to those who haven't found theirs yet. After each session, recruits would line up just to shake her hand. Some cried. Some stood in stunned silence. One day, after a talk, a young soldier lingered at the back of the hall. He couldn't have been more than 20, nervous, fidgeting, unsure whether to approach. Maria smiled gently. "You can come closer, soldier, I don't bite." He walked up, clutching a small, folded photo. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think you might know my mother." Maria frowned, taking the photo. In it, a young woman in fatigue smiled under a clear blue sky. The name stitched on her uniform read Luisa Fernandez. Maria's chest tightened. "Luisa," she whispered, "I remember her." The young man nodded. "She said you were the reason she stayed in the service. She wanted me to thank you." Maria smiled, the kind that reaches the heart, not the face. "She was brave long before she met me." The boy straightened. "She said to tell you she named me after your brother." Maria's breath caught. "Miguel." He nodded. For a moment, the world seemed to go still. Maria reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then your mother gave me the greatest honor I could ever have." After he left, Maria sat alone in the empty hall, the photo resting in her lap. She thought about Luisa, the frightened recruit who'd once whispered about power and fear, who had grown into a leader, a mother, a legacy. Maria smiled through tears. The cycle had broken. The silence had ended. That evening, she walked past the kitchen one last time. The smell of rice and garlic filled the air, the same scent that had followed her through the hardest days of her life. Inside, a new head of staff, a young woman named Anna, looked up and waved. "Miss Santos, you're early." Maria chuckled. "Old habits." Anna laughed. "You can't stay away from this kitchen, can you?" "Maybe it can't stay away from me," Maria said softly. They both laughed, but Anna noticed something distant in her eyes. "Miss Santos," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you ever afraid, like really afraid?" Maria took a deep breath, her gaze softening. "Every day, even after it was over." Anna frowned. "But how did you stop being afraid?" Maria smiled faintly. "You don't. You just stop letting fear decide who you are." Later that night, Maria returned home, tired but at peace. The moonlight spilled through her window, glinting off the framed metal on her wall. Beside it hung a faded photograph, her younger self in a kitchen apron, surrounded by soldiers who hadn't yet learned her name. She stared at it for a long time. "Would you believe this, Papa?" she whispered. Your daughter, the one who scrubbed floors, changed the army. The room was silent, but in that silence she felt something warm. Not pride, not victory. Just gratitude. The next morning she woke early as always and walked to the hill. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of pine and coffee. She sat on her favorite bench, watching the flag rise. The soldiers below moved like clockwork, their shouts echoing faintly. Maria closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. So much had changed, and yet everything still felt familiar. She whispered softly, "It's all right now." That afternoon, Raphael Thompson, now a general, came to visit her. He found her sitting by the window, writing in her notebook. "Still working?" he teased. "Just finishing a thought," she said. He sat across from her, setting down a small gift box. "They're nomming the new Leadership Academy after you." Maria blinked. "What?" "It'll be called the Santos Institute of Integrity. It opens next year." Maria stared at him, stunned. "That's too much." He smiled. "No, it's not enough." She chuckled softly. "You always were good with words, Colonel." "General," he corrected with a grin. She waved a hand. "Ranks come and go. The kitchen doesn't care who's in charge." They both laughed, the kind of laughter only two people who have survived storms can share. Then Raphael grew quiet. "Maria, do you ever regret it, any of it?" She looked out the window, her eyes tracing the horizon. "No, regret belongs to those who had choices. I had survival, but I don't carry anger anymore. Only lessons." Raphael nodded. "The world is better because you stayed." Maria smiled gently. "The world gets better when someone stays after the fire." When he left, she sat for a long while, writing the final lines in her notebook, the same one she'd kept for years. "The fight ends, but the echo remains. Let it be a soft one, not of pain, but of purpose." She closed the book carefully, placed it on her table, and looked out at the sunset, a blaze of gold melting into violet. In that light, Maria Santos didn't look tired. She looked eternal. Because courage doesn't age. It simply becomes wisdom. The wind was gentle that morning, the kind that carries memory. Sunlight poured over the base, catching the flag as it rose, a rhythm Maria Santos had watched every day for decades. But this morning was different. The hill where she always sat stood empty. Only her notebook remained on the bench, open to its final page, a pen resting neatly beside it. On that page, in her delicate, steady handwriting, were the words, "When silence no longer frightens you, it means you've made peace with your past." They found her sitting there, calm as sleep, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were closed, her lips faintly curved, not into a smile but something gentler, acceptance. The soldiers who discovered her didn't speak at first. They just stood there, realizing who she was, what she meant. And in that moment, even the wind seemed to bow. Word spread quickly across the base. The mess hall went quiet, the training fields fell still. From every building, soldiers stepped out, one by one, until hundreds gathered at the flagpole where the morning sun burned bright against the sky. General Raphael Thompson stood at the front, his cap tucked under his arm, his voice low and steady. "Today," he said, "we lower the flag not for an officer, not for a commander, but for a woman who taught us what honor truly means." The flag began to descend. The soldiers stood at attention, eyes forward, but many had tears they didn't bother to hide. Because they all knew she had given them something far greater than victory. She had given them conscience. That evening, the sun set slow and heavy over the southern hills. In the base courtyard, they held a small ceremony. No speeches, no cameras, no grand titles. Just the people whose lives she had touched. Carmen was there, older now, her hair streaked with gray. She placed a single white rose on the table beside Maria's photograph. "She used to say dignity doesn't speak," Carmen whispered, but I think hers still does. Beside her, Lewis's son, Miguel Fernandez, stood in uniform. He saluted the photo, tears streaming freely down his face. "My mother said you were her light," he said softly. "You'll never fade." Later that night, Raphael sat alone in his office, staring at the same notebook they'd found beside her. The pages were filled with handwriting, not of orders or memories, but of lessons. Each one short, sharp, honest. He read a few out loud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Strength doesn't always roar. Forgiveness is freedom, not surrender. The highest rank is decency. Never mistake silence for weakness." Then, on the very last page, written larger than all the rest, she had left him one final note. "Tell them I was never a hero. I was just tired of being afraid." Raphael sat back in his chair, closing the book carefully, his throat tightening. "She wasn't a hero," he murmured. "She was the standard." Weeks passed, but her absence never left the base. Her chair in the kitchen stayed untouched. Her photograph hung above the mess hall door, sunlight catching the edge of the frame each morning. Every new recruit who entered that kitchen learned her story. Not the legend, the truth. A woman who worked quietly until injustice cornered her, and then stood taller than those who tried to break her. One afternoon, a small girl ran across the base courtyard, dark hair, bright eyes, laughing as she chased her father. "Papa, who's the lady in the picture?" she asked, pointing to Maria's photo. Her father, a young officer who'd once been Maria's student, smiled softly. "That," he said, kneeling beside her, "is the reason you'll grow up in a better army." The little girl frowned. What did she do? He thought for a moment, searching for the right words. "She reminded us that doing nothing can be the loudest mistake." Years later, long after Maria's name had become history, the academy she'd inspired, the Santos Institute of Integrity, trained officers, soldiers, and diplomats from across the nation. Inside its main hall stood a bronze statue, simple, unadorned. Not of Maria in uniform, not holding medals or banners, but standing tall in an apron, her chin raised, eyes calm, hands steady at her sides. On the base of the statue were her final words. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Cadets passed that statue every morning. Some saluted it, some whispered a quiet thank you. All understood the message, that courage is not in commanding others, but in commanding yourself. Raphael grew old too. When he retired, he often visited the institute, walking through its halls in silence. Every time he passed the statue, he paused and said, "Still watching us, aren't you, Maria?" He'd smile faintly, as if hearing her answer in the wind. And sometimes, when the sunlight caught the statue just right, the bronze seemed almost alive, the faintest hint of warmth in the metal, like it remembered the fire she once carried. Decades after her death, a journalist produced a documentary titled "The Cook Who Changed Command." It opened with a single image, the kitchen door, sunlight spilling through the window. And the narrator's voice, calm, reverent, said, "They called her a servant. They ignored her name, her silence, her strength. Until one day, she stood up and reminded the world that authority without humanity is nothing at all." In classrooms, soldiers watched that film in silence. Some cried, some clenched their fists. And every instructor ended the lesson the same way. "When you wear this uniform, remember, you serve the people beside you, not the power above you." That's what Maria Santos taught us. Far away, on the southern hill where she once sat, a small plaque rests beneath an oak tree. It reads, "Maria Santos, 1953-2028. She fought not to win, but to end the fight." And beneath it, carved smaller, "Fear bow, dignity stood." At sunrise, soldiers still climb that hill before duty. Some come to think, some to thank. But all of them leave a little stronger. Because the story of Maria Santos, the cook who broke silence, who stood her ground, who changed the face of an army, was never about revenge or defiance or pride. It was about something far quieter, far greater. A promise that even in a world built on rank and command, the truest power belongs to those who choose integrity over fear. And as the voiceover fades, the screen turns black. Her final words echo softly one last time. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.